The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Afghan mountains as Captain Sarah Phoenix Rodriguez performed her final pre-flight checks on her A-10 Thunderbolt. The twin-engine aircraft sat on the dusty airstrip at Bagram Air Base, its distinctive nose art showing a fierce phoenix rising from flames. Sarah had painted it herself after her first combat mission 6 months ago. At 28 years old, Sarah was one of only a handful of female A-10 pilots in the Air Force. Growing up in rural Texas, she had always dreamed of flying. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, initially opposed her military ambitions, fearing for her safety. But Sarah's determination was unshakable. She graduated top of her flight school class and specifically requested assignment to the A-10 program. Drawn to its reputation as the ultimate ground support aircraft, the A-10 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Warthog by pilots, was built around its massive 30mm GAU-8 cannon. The aircraft could withstand incredible damage and still bring pilots home. Sarah loved everything about her plane: its raw power, its ability to fly low and slow, and most importantly, its mission of protecting troops on the ground. This particular morning felt different somehow. Sarah had learned to trust her instincts during her deployment, and something seemed off. The briefing had been routine, a standard patrol mission over the Kunar province, where Taliban activity had increased in recent weeks. Intelligence suggested possible insurgent movement near a remote village, but nothing that seemed to require immediate concern. As Sarah climbed into her cockpit, her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Martinez, gave her a thumbs up. They had worked together for months, and Martinez took pride in maintaining Sarah's aircraft in perfect condition. The trust between pilot and crew chief was absolute. Sarah's life depended on Martinez's expertise, and both understood this sacred responsibility. The radio crackled to life as Sarah started her engines. "Phoenix, this is Tower. You're cleared for takeoff. Have a safe flight out there." Sarah acknowledged and began her taxi to the runway. The familiar rumble of the twin turbofan engines filled her with confidence. This was her element, her purpose. 20 minutes into her patrol, everything changed. The radio erupted with panicked voices. A Navy SEAL team, call sign Trident 6, had walked into a massive ambush in a valley 30 miles from Sarah's position. The initial report was devastating. 12 SEALs trapped in a narrow canyon, surrounded by an estimated 40 Taliban fighters positioned on the high ground. Sarah immediately changed course, pushing her throttles forward. The A-10 responded eagerly, its engines roaring as she descended toward the mountains. Through her radio, she could hear the desperate calls from the SEAL team leader, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, a veteran of multiple deployments who had never sounded shaken until now. The situation was worse than anyone initially realized. The SEALs had been conducting a reconnaissance mission when they were ambushed from 3 sides. Taliban fighters had used the terrain expertly, positioning themselves on ridgelines that provided perfect firing positions while offering numerous escape routes. The Americans were pinned down in a dried riverbed with minimal cover, taking casualties and running low on ammunition. 2 Apache helicopters had already attempted rescue missions, but the intense ground fire had forced them to retreat. 1 Apache had taken significant damage, its pilot wounded by shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade. The mountain terrain made evacuation nearly impossible, and the Taliban fighters seemed to have endless supplies of ammunition and explosives. Sarah studied her tactical display as she approached the area. The valley was a death trap, narrow with steep walls on both sides, exactly the kind of terrain that favored defenders over attackers. Previous air support attempts had failed because the high ridgelines limited attack angles and gave the enemy multiple positions from which to fire surface-to-air missiles. As she flew closer, Sarah could see smoke rising from the valley floor. The radio chatter painted a grim picture. 3 SEALs were already wounded, including their medic. They were completely surrounded and their ammunition was running dangerously low. The Taliban fighters showed no signs of retreating, apparently confident that time was on their side. The nearest reinforcements were hours away, and medevac helicopters couldn't approach due to the intense ground fire. Sarah realized she might be the only thing standing between the SEAL team and complete disaster. The weight of 12 lives rested on her shoulders, and failure was not an option. Sarah had trained extensively for close air support missions, but this situation exceeded anything in the training manuals. The enemy positions were too close to friendly forces for standard bombing runs, and the terrain limited her approach options severely. She would need to use every skill she had learned and push both herself and her aircraft to the absolute limit. Beak. Radio crackled again with Morrison's voice, now strained with pain and exhaustion. Any air support, this is Trident 6. We're taking heavy fire from all sides. We have 3 wounded and are running low on ammo. Request immediate assistance. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah keyed her radio. Trident 6. This is Phoenix. I'm inbound to your position. Give me your exact coordinates and enemy positions. Even as she spoke, she knew she was facing the most challenging mission of her career. The lives of America's elite warriors hung in the balance, and she was their only hope. Sarah banked her A-10 sharply as she approached the valley, her eyes scanning the terrain below. The mountains rose like jagged teeth around a narrow canyon where the SEAL team was trapped. Smoke drifted from multiple points along the ridgelines, marking enemy positions. The Taliban had chosen their ambush site perfectly. Through her targeting system, Sarah could see muzzle flashes winking from the hillsides like deadly stars. The enemy had positioned themselves in a classic horseshoe formation with overlapping fields of fire that left the Americans with no escape route. Every few seconds, explosions erupted near the SEAL positions as rocket-propelled grenades impacted around them. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice crackled through the radio again, barely audible over the sound of gunfire. Phoenix, we're in a dried creek bed about 50 meters north of the large boulder. Enemy positions on ridges to our north, east, and south. We've got wounded who need immediate evacuation, but we can't move under this fire. Sarah circled higher, studying the tactical situation. The valley was roughly 800 meters long and only 200 meters wide at its narrowest point. The SEALs were trapped in the center, using scattered rocks and a slight depression in the ground for cover. Taliban fighters occupied positions along 3 ridgelines approximately 100 to 300 meters above the valley floor. The challenge was immediately apparent. Standard close air support doctrine required a minimum distance between friendly forces and target areas to prevent friendly fire incidents. In this situation, the enemy was so close to the SEALs that any miscalculation could be catastrophic. Sarah would need to thread the needle with precision that left no room for error. She contacted the Joint Terminal Attack Controller at Bagram for guidance, but the response only confirmed what she already knew. Phoenix, be advised that current rules of engagement require minimum 500-meter separation between friendly forces and impact points. Recommend you maintain safe distance until ground situation changes. Sarah looked down at the embattled SEALs and made a decision that would define her career. Understood, but negative. I'm going in. She switched to the SEAL frequency. Trident 6, I need you to mark your exact position with smoke and give me precise locations of enemy positions. I'm coming in low. Morrison's response was immediate. Phoenix, the enemy is too close. You'll never be able to engage without hitting us. Despite his desperate situation, the SEAL commander was trying to protect her from an impossible mission. Let me worry about that, Sarah replied, already beginning her descent. Just trust me and keep your heads down. Sarah dropped her A-10 to barely 500 feet above the ridgeline, so low that she could see individual Taliban fighters scrambling for better positions. The enemy immediately turned their attention to her aircraft, filling the air with tracer rounds and launching shoulder-fired missiles. Her threat warning system screamed constant alerts as multiple weapons locked onto her aircraft. The A-10's armor plating deflected several small arms rounds with metallic pings that Sarah could hear even over her engines. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded close enough to shake the aircraft violently, but the Warthog held together. Sarah had never been more grateful for her plane's legendary durability. She lined up for her first attack run, targeting a machine gun nest on the eastern ridge that had been pouring fire down on the SEALs. The angle was nearly impossible. She had to attack along the length of the valley to avoid hitting friendly forces, which meant flying directly through the crossfire of all 3 enemy positions. Sarah armed her 30mm cannon and began her attack. Dive. The A-10 Gatling gun could fire 3,900 rounds per minute, each depleted uranium shell capable of destroying light armor. But accuracy at this range and angle would require perfect flying and split-second timing. Tracer fire streaked past her cockpit as she dove toward the target. Sarah ignored the incoming fire, focusing entirely on her gun sight. The machine gun position filled her reticle, and she squeezed the trigger for a 2-second burst. The A-10 shuddered as 78 rounds screamed downrange in a tight pattern. "Daitiu." Enemy position disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. Sarah pulled up hard, yanking the stick back and rolling left to avoid a missile launched from another position. Her aircraft groaned under the G-forces, but the attack had been successful. The eastern ridge was temporarily silenced, but the victory was short-lived. Taliban reinforcements were already moving to replace the destroyed position, and the remaining fighters had adjusted their tactics. Instead of maintaining static positions, they were now moving constantly, making targeting much more difficult. Morrison's voice came through the radio with obvious relief mixed with urgency. "Phoenix, good hit on the eastern position, but we've got more problems. Enemy fighters are moving down the slopes toward our position. If they get close enough for grenades, we're finished." Sarah could see the movement Morrison described. Groups of Taliban fighters were using dead ground and rocky outcrops to advance down the hillsides. They moved in small groups using fire and maneuver tactics that showed considerable training and experience. These weren't amateur insurgents. They were skilled fighters who understood mountain warfare. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The SEALs were nearly out of ammunition. 3 of their number were wounded and couldn't return effective fire, and enemy fighters were closing in for a final assault. Traditional air support tactics weren't working in this terrain against these tactics. Sarah realized she needed to change her approach entirely. Instead of trying to destroy enemy positions from a distance, she would need to get down in the weeds and engage in close-quarters aerial combat. It was dangerous beyond measure, but it was the only way to break up the Taliban assault before they overran the SEAL position. She keyed her radio to Morrison. "Trident 6. I'm going to make multiple low passes to disrupt the enemy advance. When I do, I need your people to be ready to move to better cover. There's a larger rock formation about 30 meters to your west that will give you better protection." Morrison understood immediately. "Roger, Phoenix. We'll be ready to move on your signal." Sarah began her descent again, this time intending to fly even lower than before. She would use her aircraft as both weapon and shield, drawing enemy fire away from the SEALs while engaging targets of opportunity. It was the kind of mission that existed on the edge between heroism and insanity, but 12 American lives depended on her willingness to cross that line. Sarah pushed her A-10 into a steep dive that would take her between the ridgelines at an altitude that defied all conventional wisdom. At barely 300 feet above the valley floor, she was flying lower than the mountain peaks on either side, essentially trapped in a canyon with hostile forces above and friendly forces below. The Taliban fighters immediately concentrated their fire on her aircraft. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the air around her cockpit like deadly fireworks. A heavy machine gun on the northern ridge opened up, its bullets striking her right wing and fuselage. Sarah felt the impacts through her flight controls but pressed her attack. She lined up on a group of Taliban fighters who were advancing down a rocky slope toward the SEAL position. These men were moving in bounds, using covering fire and tactical movement that spoke of professional training. Sarah armed her cannon again, knowing that precision was critical with friendlies so close below. The targeting was nightmarishly difficult. She had to account for the aircraft's motion, the slope of the terrain, the movement of her targets, and most critically, the exact position of the trapped Americans. A mistake of even a few degrees could mean hitting her own people. Sarah fired a controlled burst, walking her rounds up the slope. The 30mm shells struck among the advancing Taliban fighters, sending several diving for cover and stopping their advance cold. But the victory cost her dearly. Flying straight and level for those few seconds had made her an easy target for the enemy gunners. A rocket-propelled grenade detonated just off her left wing, close enough that the blast wave rolled the aircraft violently, her cockpit filled with smoke as warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel. The left engine's temperature spiked dangerously, and she could see damage to the wing's leading edge through her mirrors. Sarah fought to maintain control as she pulled up and away from the valley. The A-10 responded sluggishly, clearly damaged but still flying. She quickly scanned her engine instruments. The left turbofan was running hot and showing signs of internal damage, but it was still producing power. The right engine was unaffected, which meant she could continue the fight. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with desperate urgency. "Phoenix, we're taking heavy fire from the northern ridge. They've got us pinned down completely. We need immediate suppression on that position or we're not going to make it." Sarah looked toward the northern ridgeline and saw the problem immediately. A well-concealed heavy machine gun position was pouring sustained fire down on the SEAL. Location. The gun was positioned in a natural rock fortification that provided excellent cover while allowing a commanding field of fire. Previous air attacks had failed to locate it precisely because of its concealment. But Sarah's low-level approach had given her a unique perspective. From her angle, she could see the muzzle flashes clearly, and more importantly, she had identified a possible approach route that might allow her to engage the position effectively. The approach would require flying directly up the valley floor, staying below the ridgeline to avoid most of the anti-aircraft fire, then pulling up at the last second to engage the machine gun nest. It was incredibly dangerous. She would be flying into a funnel of crossfire with limited maneuverability and no escape route except straight ahead. Sarah made the decision without hesitation. Trident 6, I'm making a gun run on the northern position. Keep everyone down and be ready to move when I engage. She rolled her damaged aircraft into position and began her approach up the valley. Flying at barely 200 feet above the rocky floor, Sarah could see individual stones and scrub brush flashing past her cockpit. The valley walls rose on either side like the jaws of a trap, and enemy fire rained down from multiple positions. Her aircraft took more hits as she flew up the valley. Bullets punched through the fuselage and wings, and another RPG explosion rocked the plane violently. But the A-10's legendary toughness kept her airborne, its redundant systems and armored cockpit providing protection that no other aircraft could match. As she approached the machine gun position, Sarah could see the enemy gunners clearly. They were brave fighters who held their position even as her aircraft bore down on them, continuing to fire at the SEALs below even as death approached from above. Sarah pulled back on the stick and climbed sharply, bringing her nose up to bear on the target. The machine gun position filled her gun sight and she could see the muzzle flashes clearly. This was the shot that would determine whether the SEALs lived or died. She squeezed the trigger and held it for a full 3-second burst. The A-10's cannon thundered, sending over 200 rounds of 30mm ammunition into the rocky fortification. The depleted uranium shells shattered stone and metal alike, turning the enemy position into a cloud of dust and debris. The effect was immediate and devastating. The machine gun fire that had been hammering the SEALs suddenly stopped. Through the settling dust, Sarah could see that the position had been completely destroyed, its occupants silenced forever. But her victory had come at a price. As she pulled up from the attack, multiple surface-to-air missiles launched from positions around the valley. Her threat warning system screamed constantly as the missiles tracked her aircraft. Sarah threw the A-10 into a series of violent, evasive maneuvers, deploying chaff and flares while diving for the deck. One missile detonated close enough to pepper her aircraft with shrapnel. She felt the aircraft shudder as metal fragments struck the fuselage and wings. Her left engine finally began to fail, its temperature climbing into the red zone as internal components gave way to battle damage. Sarah shut down the failing engine and continued on single-engine power. The A-10 could fly on one engine, though with reduced performance and maneuverability. More concerning was the damage to her flight controls. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to handle, requiring constant pressure on the stick to maintain level flight. Despite her aircraft's condition, Sarah could see that her attack had broken the Taliban's momentum. The devastating loss of their primary fire support position had forced the remaining fighters to take cover, giving the SEALs their first respite in hours. Morrison's voice came through the radio, filled with gratitude and amazement. "Phoenix, that was an incredible shot. The northern position is completely destroyed. We're moving to better cover now while the enemy is regrouping." But Sarah knew the battle was far from over. The Taliban still held advantageous positions on 2 ridgelines, and they would soon recover from the shock of losing their machine gun nest. She needed to press her advantage while she still had the element of surprise, and before her damaged aircraft became unable to continue the fight. Looking down at the SEAL position, Sarah could see the Americans moving quickly to the better cover she had identified earlier. They moved with the efficiency of elite warriors, carrying their wounded comrades and repositioning their defensive perimeter in anticipation of the next enemy assault. The Taliban fighters were already adapting to her tactics, spreading out more, and using better concealment. They had learned to respect the deadly accuracy of her cannon, but they hadn't given up their attempt to overrun the American position. Sarah realized that breaking up their assault would require even more aggressive tactics than she had used so far. With her left engine smoking and multiple systems damaged, Sarah faced a critical decision. Standard procedure dictated that she should return to base for emergency repairs, but leaving now would condemn the SEAL team to certain death. The remaining Taliban positions still commanded the high ground, and reinforcements were reportedly moving toward the valley from multiple directions. Sarah checked her fuel gauge and weapon status. She had enough ammunition for perhaps 2 more significant engagements and fuel for maybe 20 minutes of combat operations. Her damaged flight controls made precise maneuvering increasingly difficult, but the A-10 was still responding to her commands. Through her radio, she could hear the tactical situation developing. Intelligence reports indicated that additional Taliban fighters were approaching the valley from 2 different directions. If they arrived before the SEALs could be evacuated, the already desperate situation would become completely hopeless. Morrison's voice crackled through the static. "Phoenix, we've reached better cover, but we're spotting movement on the southern ridge. Looks like they're setting up another heavy weapon position. We also have reports of enemy reinforcements moving up the eastern approach to the valley." Sarah banked her aircraft to get a better view of the southern ridge. Through her targeting optics, she could see Taliban fighters manhandling what appeared to be a recoilless rifle into position. The weapon would give them the capability to destroy the rocks the SEALs were using for cover, eliminating their defensive advantage entirely. The tactical picture was becoming increasingly complex. Sarah needed to engage multiple targets spread across difficult terrain while avoiding friendly fire and managing her aircraft's growing mechanical problems. Her left engine was now completely shut down. Metal fragments had damaged her hydraulic systems, and bullet holes in her wings were affecting her aircraft's aerodynamics. She decided to engage the recoilless rifle position first, since it posed the most immediate threat to the pinned-down SEALs. The approach would require another low-level attack run through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, but there was no alternative. Sarah lined up for her attack, approaching the southern ridge from an angle that would minimize her exposure to the remaining enemy positions. As she dove toward the target, the familiar pattern of tracer fire began to fill the air around her aircraft. The Taliban gunners had learned her tactics and were ready. A heavy machine gun on the eastern ridge opened up, its bullets striking her aircraft's armored belly with a sound like hail on a tin roof. Sarah maintained her attack dive, ignoring the impacts as she focused on the recoilless rifle position ahead. The enemy weapon crew was working frantically to get their gun into action before she could reach them. Sarah could see them loading a shell into the breech as her aircraft bore down on their position. It would be a race between her cannon and their ability to engage the SEALs below. Sarah fired a short burst from extreme range, knowing that accuracy would be reduced but hoping to disrupt the enemy crew's preparations. Her shells struck around the position, sending up geysers of rock and dirt. The enemy soldiers dove for cover, temporarily abandoning their weapon. But as Sarah pulled up from her attack run, the recoilless rifle crew returned to their gun. They had been shaken, but not destroyed, and they were determined to complete their mission. Sarah realized she would need to make another pass despite her aircraft's deteriorating condition and the increasing intensity of enemy fire. As she repositioned for a second attack, her threat warning system suddenly screamed a new alert. A shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile had locked onto her aircraft, launched from a position she hadn't previously identified. The missile was closing fast, and her damaged aircraft's reduced maneuverability made evasive action extremely difficult. Sarah threw the A-10 into a hard left turn, deploying flares and diving toward the valley floor. The missile detonated close enough to her right wing to send shrapnel through the cockpit. She felt a sharp pain in her left arm, where a metal fragment had penetrated the armored glass and struck her. Blood began to seep through her flight suit, sleeve, but Sarah ignored the wound. She had more pressing concerns. The missile blast had damaged her right engine's air intake, causing it to surge and lose power intermittently. She was now flying on barely adequate power, with increasingly unresponsive controls. Despite her aircraft's condition, Sarah could see that the recoilless rifle crew was preparing to fire at the SEAL position. The weapon was now loaded and aimed, and she could see the gunner taking his final sight picture. In seconds, the SEAL's protective cover would be blasted apart, leaving them completely exposed. Sarah made a decision that went beyond courage, into the realm of the impossible. Instead of making another conventional attack run, she would use her aircraft itself as a weapon. She would fly directly at the enemy position at maximum speed, using her presence to force the gun crew to take cover while engaging them with her cannon at point-blank range. The maneuver was essentially a controlled collision course with a mountain. Sarah would have to fire her guns while flying directly at solid rock, then pull up at the last possible second to avoid crashing. With her damaged controls and reduced engine power, there was no guarantee she could pull out of the dive in time. Sarah pushed her throttle forward and dove toward the recoilless rifle position. The A-10 accelerated despite its damage, and Sarah could feel the aircraft vibrating as it approached its structural limits. Enemy fire converged on her from multiple positions, but she maintained her trajectory, focusing entirely on the target. Ahead, the recoilless rifle crew saw her coming and abandoned their weapon, diving for cover among the rocks. But Sarah knew they would return as soon as she passed, and the next time they might complete their mission before she could stop them. As her aircraft closed to within 200 meters of the target, Sarah opened fire with her cannon. The 30mm shells walked across the rocky position, destroying the recoilless rifle and eliminating the crew members who hadn't reached cover in time. The weapon that could have ended the SEAL's resistance was reduced to twisted metal and scattered debris. Sarah pulled back on the stick with all her strength, fighting her damaged controls to bring the aircraft's nose up before impact. The A-10 responded slowly, its damaged flight surfaces struggling to generate enough lift to pull out of the dive. The rocky slope rushed toward her cockpit at terrifying speed. For a moment, it seemed certain that she would crash into the mountainside. Sarah's altimeter unwound rapidly as the ground filled her windscreen, but the A-10's inherent stability and her own flying skill combined to pull the aircraft out of its dive, with barely 50 feet to spare. As she climbed away from the ridge, Sarah realized that her desperate attack had achieved more than just destroying the recoilless rifle. The psychological impact of her near-suicidal assault had been devastating to Taliban morale. Enemy fighters across all positions had witnessed her willingness to die rather than allow them to harm the trapped Americans, and many were beginning to withdraw from their positions. Morrison's voice came through the radio with undisguised amazement. "Phoenix, I don't know how you did that, but the southern position is completely destroyed. We're seeing enemy fighters pulling back from multiple positions. Whatever you just did, it's working." But Sarah's victory had come at a tremendous cost. Her aircraft was now barely controllable, with extensive damage to both engines, her flight control systems, and her hydraulics. Warning lights illuminated her instrument panel like a deadly Christmas tree, and she could feel the A-10 fighting her every command. Most critically, she was rapidly running out of both fuel and ammunition. The continuous high-power operations and battle damage had consumed her fuel at an alarming rate, and she had perhaps enough cannon rounds for one more significant engagement. The mathematical reality was stark. She could not sustain this level of operations much longer. Sarah's aircraft was dying around her. Both engines were running rough, her hydraulic pressure was dropping steadily, and her fuel gauge showed less than 15 minutes of flight time remaining. Blood from her wounded arm had soaked through, her flight suit, and she could feel her strength slowly ebbing. But the battle was not over. Intelligence reports crackled through her radio with devastating news. A large force of Taliban reinforcements, estimated at over 60 fighters, was approaching the valley from the east. They were moving in organized formations and carried heavy weapons, including mortars and additional rocket-propelled grenades. If they reached the valley before the SEALs could be evacuated, the Americans would be completely overwhelmed. Morrison's voice reflected the desperate reality of their situation. "Phoenix, we can see the reinforcements moving down the eastern slope. They'll be in firing positions within 10 minutes. Our ammunition is critically low and we have 4 wounded who can't fight effectively. We need immediate extraction, but the landing zone is still too hot for helicopters." Sarah looked at her fuel gauge again and made rapid calculations. She had perhaps enough fuel for 2 more attack runs, maybe 3 if she pushed her engines to their absolute limits. Her cannon ammunition counter showed fewer than 300 rounds remaining, enough for about 8 seconds of firing time. The approaching reinforcements were her primary concern, but she also had to deal with the remaining Taliban positions that still commanded parts of the valley. Even with reduced numbers, these fighters could prevent helicopter evacuation and keep the SEALs pinned down until the reinforcements arrived. Sarah decided to engage the reinforcements first, hoping to break up their formation before they could coordinate with the existing enemy positions. She turned her damaged aircraft toward the eastern approach, where she could see groups of fighters moving down the mountainside in tactical formations. As she approached the target area, Sarah realized the full scope of the challenge. The reinforcements weren't a disorganized rabble. They were moving with military precision, using covering fire and movement techniques that suggested professional training. They had also learned from the fate of their comrades and were maintaining better dispersion and concealment. Sarah began her attack run, diving toward the lead elements of the enemy force. As expected, they immediately returned fire with everything they had. Tracer rounds filled the air around her cockpit, and multiple rocket-propelled grenades streaked toward her aircraft. Her threat warning system was screaming constantly as several shoulder-fired missiles locked onto her heat signature. Sarah deployed her remaining flares and threw the A-10 into evasive maneuvers that pushed her damaged flight controls to their breaking point. A missile detonated just behind her aircraft, close enough that the blast wave slammed her forward against her restraint harness. New warning lights illuminated as the explosion damaged her vertical stabilizer and rudder. The A-10 became even more difficult to control, requiring constant corrections to maintain level flight. But Sarah pressed her attack, firing her cannon into the advancing Taliban formations. Her aim was still deadly accurate, and the 30mm shells scattered the enemy forces and forced them to seek cover. Several fighters were killed or wounded, and the coordinated advance was temporarily disrupted. However, Sarah's success came at the cost of most of her remaining ammunition. Her cannon rounds counter showed fewer than 100 rounds left, barely 2 seconds of firing time. She was rapidly approaching the point where she would be unable to provide effective fire support. As she pulled up from her attack run, Sarah's right engine finally began to fail completely. The battle damage had finally overwhelmed the turbofan's ability to operate, and it was winding down with ominous grinding noises. Sarah shut it down before it could seize completely and cause a fire. Now flying on no engines at all, Sarah's A-10 was effectively a glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. The aircraft was losing altitude steadily, and she had only minutes before she would be forced to attempt an emergency landing in hostile territory. But even as her aircraft died around her, Sarah could see that her attacks had achieved their intended effect. The Taliban reinforcements had been scattered and were regrouping more slowly. Some groups appeared to be withdrawing entirely, apparently convinced that the cost of the assault was becoming too high. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with the first hopeful news in hours. "Phoenix, the eastern reinforcements are pulling back. We can see them withdrawing to higher ground. The remaining enemy positions in the valley have also reduced their fire significantly." Sarah realized that her sustained attacks had finally broken Taliban morale. The psychological impact of facing an enemy who seemed willing to die rather than retreat had proven too much for many of the fighters. They were beginning to abandon positions that had seemed unassailable just hours earlier. But Sarah's personal situation was becoming critical. Without engine power, her aircraft was descending rapidly toward the mountainous terrain. She had perhaps 3 minutes before she would be forced to eject or attempt a crash landing. Either option would leave the SEALs without air support, just when rescue helicopters might finally be able to reach them. Sarah made one final decision that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. Instead of ejecting or trying to save herself, she would use her aircraft's remaining momentum for one last attack on the enemy positions that were still preventing helicopter evacuation. She aimed her powerless aircraft at the largest remaining concentration of Taliban fighters, located on a ridge that commanded the potential helicopter landing zone. It was essentially a kamikaze attack, using her aircraft itself as a weapon against the enemy positions. As the A-10 glided toward the target, Sarah armed her remaining cannon rounds. She would fire every remaining shell at the enemy position, then eject at the last possible moment if she was lucky enough to have time for it. The maneuver would either clear the way for helicopter evacuation or result in her death, but there was no middle ground. Taliban fighters on the ridge saw her unpowered aircraft approaching and realized her intentions. They concentrated their fire on her cockpit, desperately trying to kill her before she could complete her final attack. Bullets shattered her canopy and filled the cockpit with flying debris, but Sarah maintained her trajectory. At 300 meters from the target, Sarah opened fire with her remaining ammunition. Every shell she had left streaked toward the enemy position in one final devastating barrage. The Taliban position disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris as nearly 130mm rounds impacted in rapid succession. The psychological effect was immediate and decisive. The surviving Taliban fighters across the entire valley began abandoning their positions and fleeing toward higher ground. The sustained attacks by a single pilot, who seemed impossible to kill or deter, had finally broken their will to fight. Sarah pulled her ejection handle with barely 200 feet of altitude remaining. The rocket-powered seat blasted her clear of the doomed aircraft just seconds before it crashed into the mountainside in a fireball that could be seen for miles. As she descended beneath her parachute, Sarah could see rescue helicopters approaching the valley from multiple directions. The landing zone was finally clear, and the SEALs would be evacuated within minutes. Her mission had been accomplished, though at a cost that no one could have anticipated when the day began. Sarah's parachute drifted down toward the rocky valley floor as the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder. Her left arm throbbed from the shrapnel wound, and her body ached from the violent ejection, but she was alive. More importantly, the valley below was finally clear of enemy fire for the first time in hours. The first rescue helicopter, a massive CH-47 Chinook, touched down near the SEAL position within minutes of Sarah's ejection. The twin-rotor aircraft had been circling, just outside the valley, waiting for the all-clear signal that Sarah's sacrifice had finally provided. Behind it, 2 Apache gunships maintained overwatch, their pilots scanning for any remaining Taliban threats. Lieutenant Commander Morrison and his team moved quickly toward the landing helicopter, carrying their wounded comrades with the efficiency born of countless training exercises. Despite their exhaustion and injuries, the SEALs maintained their tactical discipline, establishing a defensive perimeter around the landing zone until everyone was safely aboard. Sarah landed hard on the rocky ground about 400 meters from the helicopter, her parachute dragging her several feet before she could collapse it. The impact sent waves of pain through her injured arm, but she managed to activate her survival radio and signal her position to the rescue forces. Within minutes, a search and rescue team was moving toward her location. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the team's medic, reached Sarah first and immediately began assessing her injuries. "Captain, we need to get you to that helicopter right now. You've lost a lot of blood, and we need to get you proper medical attention." As the rescue team helped Sarah to her feet, she could see her A-10 burning on the mountainside where it had crashed. The aircraft that had been her partner through months of combat missions was now a twisted wreck of metal and memories. But her sacrifice had achieved its purpose. 12 American warriors were going home alive. The evacuation proceeded smoothly, with all personnel loaded aboard the Chinook within 20 minutes of landing. As the helicopter lifted off and turned toward Bagram Air Base, Sarah found herself sitting next to Morrison, both of them bandaged and exhausted but alive. Morrison looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude, amazement, and professional respect. "Captain, I've been in special operations for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what you did today. You saved 12 lives at the cost of your own aircraft and nearly your own life. There aren't words for that kind of courage." Sarah managed a weak smile despite her pain and exhaustion. "Just doing my job, Commander. That's what the A-10 was built for, bringing you guys home safe." She paused, looking out the helicopter's window at the mountain terrain passing below. "Besides, I couldn't let the SEALs down. My reputation would never recover." The flight back to Bagram took 45 minutes, during which Sarah received intravenous fluids and pain medication from the helicopter's medical team. Her shrapnel wound required immediate surgery, and she had sustained a concussion during her ejection, but her injuries were not life-threatening. As news of the rescue spread throughout the base, Sarah found herself the center of attention she had never sought. Her actions during the Valley battle had been monitored by commanders throughout the military hierarchy, and preliminary reports were already describing her performance as extraordinary. The formal investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of Sarah's achievement. Over the course of 4 hours, she had single-handedly engaged more than 100 enemy fighters, destroyed multiple heavy weapon positions, and prevented the loss of an entire SEAL team. She had accomplished this while flying a severely damaged aircraft with failing systems, ultimately sacrificing her plane and nearly her life to complete the mission. The military awards that followed were unprecedented for a single mission. Sarah received the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, and was recommended for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. Her actions became a case study taught at military academies and flight schools around the world, but perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 3 months after the Valley battle, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a piece of metal from her crashed A-10, polished and mounted on a wooden base with a simple inscription, "To Phoenix, from Trident 6. Thanks for bringing us home." The recovery from her injuries took several months, during which Sarah struggled with the psychological aftermath of her experience. The knowledge that she had taken human lives, even in the defense of her countrymen, weighed heavily on her mind. She worked with military counselors to process the trauma and guilt that accompanied her heroic actions. During her recovery, Sarah learned more about the SEALs she had saved. Morrison was a father of 3 who had been planning to retire after his current deployment. Petty Officer Williams was just 22 years old and had been married only 6 months before deploying. Each of the 12 men had families, dreams, and futures that her actions had preserved. When Sarah was finally cleared to return to flight status, she faced a decision about her future. The Air Force offered her any assignment she wanted, recognizing her as one of their most decorated pilots. She could have chosen a prestigious staff position, a training command, or even a transfer to test pilot school. Instead, Sarah chose to return to combat operations, this time as a flight instructor for new A-10 pilots. She wanted to pass on the lessons she had learned about close air support, about pushing beyond the limits of what seemed possible, and about the sacred responsibility pilots bore to the soldiers on the ground. Years later, Sarah would retire as a colonel, having trained hundreds of pilots in the art of close air support. Many of her students would go on to their own distinguished careers, carrying forward the lessons learned in an Afghan valley where one pilot proved that courage and skill could overcome impossible odds. The valley where the battle took place was eventually secured by coalition forces and became part of a larger counterinsurgency operation. Local villagers later reported that Taliban fighters in the region had developed a superstitious fear of A-10 aircraft, believing that they were flown by pilots who could not be killed or deterred. Sarah's story became legend within the military, aviation community, but she always deflected praise by pointing to her aircraft and the training she had received. "The A-10 brought me home," she would tell audiences at military events. And good training gave me the skills to bring my guys home too. That's what this job is really about. The bond between Sarah and the SEALs she saved endured long after their military service ended. They maintained contact through social media and annual reunions, sharing the unique connection that exists between people who have faced death together and emerged victorious through mutual sacrifice and determination. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, who retired shortly after the Valley battle, would often speak about Sarah's actions to veteran groups and military audiences. "She didn't just save our lives," he would tell listeners. "She showed us what it means to never give up, no matter how impossible the situation seems. That's a lesson that applies to every challenge we face in life." The story of Captain Sarah Rodriguez and the Valley Rescue became more than just a military tale. It became a testament to the power of individual courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and a reminder that heroes are often ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when their fellow human beings need them most.